Hey guys, what's happening? So I'm guessing a lot of you guys are wondering why I haven't streamed in like a week, at least those of you who watch my daily streams over on twitch.tv. Yeah, I hate people who do air quotes. Anyway, the reason that I haven't been streaming is, well, in part because I've been working on a bit of a secret project that I guess I'll just lay on you now. I've been working on a very lengthy and sort of concise beginner guide to Runeterra. I've been calling it a beginner guide, but I'm getting into a lot more intermediate topics as well. Stuff that's going to help. I kind of want the guide to take you to masters, right? It's like you are a beginner starting here, now you're a master's level player. So it's like, it's not just a beginner guide, it'll take you the entire way. And the other reason I haven't been streaming was because I made this deck guide for this pool scouts list that has a 56% win rate and everyone's playing scouts on ladder, and I didn't want to play in a ladder like that. That's just not fun. But anyway, in this process of making this guide, I realized that, you know, there's one part of this that I think would help the most of you guys by far. And if you understood this and started thinking about the game in this way, it'd probably take you to masters faster than anything else would. And so I decided to make this video. This is obviously not a part of that guide, but I was like, you know what? This is too important. I can't just wait for this full guide to be ready. People can really benefit from this now. Now, whether you are a literal new player or whether you are already in Masters, this is going to be a particularly important video to understand. So what am I talking about? It's okay. I'm talking about mana advantage, and specifically how mana advantage plays into reactivity. Reactivity being one of those words we all use, but there's a lot more going on under the surface of reactivity than we give credit for. So real quick before we get started, if you want to read this in article form instead of listening it to in this video, then you can go over to Mobalytics, where I do articles with the rest of the Glimpse Beyond team, and we have currently the one that I co-wrote with Precipic on just this topic. Put the link to that in the pinned comment if you want to check it out, or if you want to check other great articles we have from Glimpse Beyond on the Mobalytics site, because that is going to be a good stepping stone towards your path to masters. And one final thing, we're going to start in this video. It's going to be fairly basic in the beginning, but trust me, if you're like an intermediate player or if you're already in masters, there will be a lot to kind of like get into after we cover the very basics. And if you were wondering what specifically the hell this video was actually going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about stuff like open passing, open attacking, bluffing mana points effectively, and the real way that you need to be thinking about the game as both an aggro and a combo player, because I think they go very misunderstood. Okay, let's go ahead and get into it. So as mentioned, we are going to have to start fairly basic. The first principle here is the stack. Now, we all kind of know how the stack works. It's a concept from Magic. The stack is just what we call the middle of the board where spells are cast, right? When your opponent plays a spell or a skill, certain skills go on the stack. Those are, you know, sent by units. Then you will have a chance to respond to it if it's a fast or a slow speed thing. Burst things kind of bypass the stack and immediately resolve on their own. So what that means, and why this is important, is because they resolve in reverse chronological order. So if you play your Vile Feast and I respond to it with my Glimpse Beyond, then the Glimpse will happen first and the Vile Feast will get completely canceled because it doesn't have a target anymore. Listen, I know most of you guys know this, but I said we're starting basic. Just trust me, okay? So we have to explain exactly what went on here. So let's go ahead and say that the Glimpse gets cast first and the Vile Feast comes down to counter it, right? What just happened is really, really huge. The player who tried to play Glimpse and didn't get it off is down 2 cards and 2 mana, right? They're down everything. They've given up an incredible amount, and the swing of that exchange will more likely than not dictate the outcome of the game. Like, I cannot explain how big of a swing that is when that exchange happens. And this is all to explain how reactivity is king in Legends of Runeterra. And I don't say that lightly. Reactivity in Legends of Runeterra is worth more than in any other card game. And the reason for that is actually, well, you can see that in just the cost of some of the spells, right? Like when you're new to Legends of Runeterra, you come in from Magic or Hearthstone and you're like, vengeance, 7 mana. Literally everyone does this. I've done this, like pro Magic players, like literally, you're lying to me. If you came from another card game and you're like, oh, grasp, 5 mana, drain 3, sounds good. Count me in. No. No. These cards look like dog. But because reactivity is so powerful in Legends of Runeterra, because being able to spend mana in response to the opponent doing something is so powerful, these cards have to be priced ridiculously high, and they're all still competitive. And reactivity, I don't just mean fast speed cards, by the way, because something like Ruination is also a very reactive tool. It is a reaction to the opponent developing into the turn. It is not just fast speed. It's specifically something that counters a specific line of play the opponent makes. So why is it? Why is it that in Legends of Runeterra, reactivity is so incredibly premium compared to other card games? And the reason is, well, there's a couple of reasons, but the biggest is just because in Legends of Runeterra, you play on the same turn as your opponent. And what that means is your opponent always has, full mana banked into the turn, well, depending on whether they've banked spell mana or not. But you're both playing with full mana pools on the same turn no matter what. Whereas in Magic, I mean, if you're playing a control deck, you can bank mana, but it's not the same as always having it every turn no matter what, with your own options being in play, right? So how does this affect you as a player, right? Like what does this all mean? Well, it means that when you're playing, you have to engineer game states where you have the highest amount of optionality possible. So basically what that means is that if you're playing control-y decks like Feel the Rush or Ezreal Draven, you should be passing a lot. If you're playing proactive decks, like, Scouts or Fiora Shen or whatever kind, it means that your build should likely, and this is not always true, but likely you should consider options where if you can capitalize on spell mana, you should try to slow play your early position. So, for example, I've actually been cutting more and more 1-drops in my Fiora Shen version throughout the seasons. The deck a long time ago was running Fleet Feather Tracker. Now it's not. It's just Greenglade Caretaker. And I've actually cut it down to 2 Greenglade Caretaker. Maybe I'll cut the card entirely in like a week or two. Seriously, the point of just like... And I know the card is powerful. Like that's a large part of the early pressure from Fiora Shen. But I think that we're slowly getting out of that territory where it's even worth the 1 mana. So why does it all matter? What does all of this mean? Okay, so let me paint you this picture. So we just went over the Glimpse versus Vile Feast exchange, right? And this is one of many exchanges in the game. I can tell you all right now, most games in Runeterra end up being dictated by an exchange that's in some ways similar to the Glimpse versus Vile Feast exchange, wherein one player is forced into a go fish, right? One player is in a position where they have to hope you don't have X, right? And it's a complete fork and it's just a guessing game. And if you were that player, you're fucked. Like if you're against a Field Rush player and you're forced into a position where you just have to hope they don't have whatever answer, Ruination, let's say, then you're screwed, right? I mean, you can make the play, you can hope they don't have it. Sometimes it works out, but your odds of winning are much lower than you'd like, sometimes below 50%, right? And the same is true if you're against like Ezreal Draven, you have to hope they don't have whatever, second Arachnoid Sentry or second Ravenous Flock, right? It's just a terrible position to be in. And this isn't unique to control matchups, by the way. If you're playing against Scouts, they double float into a Misfortune on turn 3, and I mean, you move in. You have no choice. You go in to kill the Misfortune, and you just hope they don't have the Sharp Sight, or you hope they don't have the Chain Vest, or whatever. And if they have it, you're completely screwed. You've wasted your you've wasted your option. They had the counter, and they will pretty much dominate the game from that point on. That's why my build of Scouts runs Chain Vests. It seemed kind of crazy at first. I was running 2 Chain Vest, but it's so impactful having that 1 mana option that you're never going to tap under. Like, I can't tell you how many games of that deck I won just off of that Chain Vest. A really ridiculous amount. I'm seriously, like, no, I'm not kidding you when I say like I'm pretty next week I'm gonna experiment like running Chain Vest in Fiora Shen. I'm very serious. Chain Vest has started to impress me so much as a card. It's ridiculous. And the entire reason for that is just because at 1 mana, I mean, you're always going to have like 1 mana, 1 spell mana is nothing if you're playing reactively. If you're taking these passes, these open attacks, and forcing the opponent to act first, and then if you have the answer, they lose. If they go in on the stack and they fail to do what their card wanted to do, they almost instantly lose the game. It's the same as with the Vile Feast and the Glimpse, right? Like if you go in to single combat my River Shaper and I riposte it, you've lost the game. The game is over, right? If you go in to, here's one of my favorite ones. If you go into single combat my Draven and I discard survival skills on the Draven with an axe and like Whirling Death, you've lost the game. My Draven is leveled up for no reason. Like that actually happens quite a bit with discard aggro. It's really funny and it's a ridiculous blowout. And this is why reactivity is so important, more so now than it's ever been in the past. But it's also just something that we've kind of underestimated in the past too. The idea of just reactivity and having the option and always having the option. This is why even aggro decks are starting to bank the first turn or first 2 turns of mana, depending on whether they're the kind of aggro deck that can actually use the spell mana in the mid game. Because so many games, you can look through so many games and you can trace it to a single pivotal point where something went on the stack and that something got countered, or it didn't get countered because that something was able to be used when the opponent ran out of mana. And again, it's because Legends of Runeterra is much more reactive than other card games. You have so many levels of interaction every single turn. Every deck has interaction with the opponent. You can't afford to not have mana. Now, this brings me to the next important topic, which is the idea of bluffing. Now, I hate this word bluffing. If you watch my streams, you know I hate this word bluffing because I'm a poker player, and bluffing, a lot of people know that it's a concept in poker, but a lot of people, nobody really uses the word right. Nobody, like, the word bluffing has taken on a meaning that isn't bluffing at all. So most people refer to bluffing as like sort of an intentional, like, I'm going to make you think I have this card kind of thing. Like it's telepathic, like, oh, you will think I have the 4 of spades. You will think it. And no, not really, no. So bluffing, what is bluffing? Let me show you a clip of me kind of in a way explaining what bluffing is. And this is a pretty easy full attack. It's basically impossible to block with the Elise there. I don't think you can ever call this bluff. That's one of the really nice things about TF and Targon that a lot of people kind of don't give credit for. Your TF can always attack, and you should always attack with TF. Like, he can never block because the odds of Pale and the punish to Pale are too high for no reason. And by not attacking, you're not only just skipping free damage, but the biggest problem with skipping attacks in a position like that is you're literally telling your opponent, I don't have Pale Cascade. Which is terrible. Why would I tell my opponent what my hand is? That's interesting. He double kegs here, which I guess interesting. So he's playing around Pale. Wow, that's pretty cool. So I'll Heimer emote. I'll commend him for his geniusness because he reads we have Pale. I'll Heimer emote so he takes it here. We bluffed Pale before and we Heimer emote because we're like, oh, he's playing around Pale. He's a genius. And then we just Bastion. And that's why, like, if you look at that attack on turn 4, we got him 2 free damage. We told him we had Pale when we didn't, and you can't call that bluff. There's something in poker we call like a bluff spot, which is a bluff that you just can't really call. Like, there's no way he can take the risk that we have Pale. And again, I see people messing that up so much, which is they skip that attack. And again, it's not about the damage. It's that you're literally just telling your opponent hand information. You're just telling them you don't have Pale by doing that. And it's just so pointless. Okay, so we can attack and we have Pale Cascade as an option, right? That's the bluff, is that we have the option to Pale Cascade, so we are able to play as if we have it. But it's not really about it's not like a random hunch. It's not like a random, oh, I'm going to make him think I have Pale Cascade here. It's just a simple mathematical option. The reason Pale Cascade is so bluffable compared to anything else, it's the most bluffable card in the game. And that's because A, you basically always have the mana to represent Pale Cascade because it's so cheap, and B, it's almost always like a really broadly applicable blowout, right? But it's mostly A. The reason Pale Cascade is so bluffable is because it's so cheap. So think about that for a second. The most important aspect of a card being bluffable is the mana point. Now, what that kind of shows us is that mana is the key component of bluffing, right? It's all about the mana and the options that you have access to. And this is, I guess, like the biggest problem I have with how most people use the word bluffing. Most people are referring to like a specific card, like, oh, I'm going to bluff like I have this here. And that's not it. That's not how bluffing works. The way you should think about it in Legends of Runeterra is that I have a big chunk of mana, therefore my opponent has to play around everything. That's what bluffing is. It's not a... I shouldn't use the word bluffing even, because it's not like I said, the word has taken on a meaning that it's never really meant in anything ever, but everyone just uses it to mean that, which is like, oh, I have this. It's not about that. It's about making sure the opponent can't know what you do have, right? It's about creating a position where they're forced to guess, and that is a really, really terrible position for the opponent. So what I'm saying with all this is that if you're playing a deck, like Field Rush Control is the best example, honestly, but part of the benefit of mana, of banking spell mana and playing reactive to your mana, which means forcing the opponent to commit their mana before you commit yours. That's what playing reactive to mana means. Now, remember that, because that comes in a few different forms. That can look like open passing. It can look like open attacking. Open attacking is a way to play reactively. More on that later. Weird, right? I know, but absolutely. Okay. That's what bluffing is. So if you're playing a deck with reactive options, having mana will passively force your opponent into weaker plays, and you won't even notice you don't even notice it's happening, right? If you're a good player, whether you have Ruination in hand or not, you'll be banking the mana, you know, because you bank the mana on turn 5, you bank 3 mana, so that on turn 6, you'll have 3 spell mana, so that if you top deck the Ruination, if you draw it on turn 6, you'll have it as an option. But also, your opponent will have to play around it. That is an incredibly important aspect to that card's position in that deck. The opponent has to play around it, but only if you bank the mana. They don't. The thing is, they don't have to play around the card if it's in your deck. It might not even be in your deck, and they still have to play around it, because it's not about the card in your deck. It's about the mana in your pool. The more mana you have, the more your opponent's plays get really awkward, and it forces them into just terrible go fish scenarios. And that's why banking spell mana is so powerful. And again, this is true not just for control decks. This is true. It's not true for every deck in the game. There's some ridiculous decks like Discard Aggro that just don't really care that much. But for almost every deck, if you bank mana, if the more mana you have, the more reactive you're playing, the worse your opponent has to play. So keep your mana high. Right? What does that look like? Well, open passing is a big one. When you're playing Field of Rush Control, Ezreal Draven, again, those are the easiest examples, but depending on a lot of decks, like, you know, Twisted Fate Go Hard can play very reactive. Those positions will be sometimes open passing to see what your opponent is going to do first. What that means is you play your mana after they play theirs, which is incredibly powerful. That is incredibly powerful. I can't even begin to explain how big of a deal that is. When you're playing a deck like Ezreal Draven, so let's say you pass first every turn starting on turn, you know, the early game doesn't even really matter. Let's say starting on turn 3. Let's say your opponent is playing a good deck that also just wants to bank mana, so they're also just passing in the first couple of turns of the game. So starting turn 3, you pass. They play something, you make your action after they make theirs, right? That means you have a better option. That means you are gaining a smarter play because you saw what they did first. Now you know the best play to commit your mana to, right? But it also means they made a worse play because you maintained reactivity. Not only are you playing that turn from a higher position of information of reactivity because you saw something they didn't, but they're playing from a lower one, right? They're playing blind into you, and it feels terrible for them. And that's why good players playing a deck like Feel the Rush Control will almost always pass first. They will almost always let you play your card before they play theirs, right? And a deck like Ezreal Draven will not always do that, not nearly to the degree that Feel the Rush Control does, but the better Ezreal Draven players will pass more and gain more reactivity, right? Now, here comes the question. Well, Swim, passing is nice, but I'm afraid that my opponent is going to pass back on me, right? And I'll be locked out of my mana, and that'll feel bad. Sometimes when you have a lot more mana than they do, like if they're only, like if you have 6 mana and they have 4, sometimes you don't want to pass because you don't want to be 2 mana negative on their pass back. But if they're an aggressive deck, they still have to spend their mana. If they're playing a deck like Draven Jinx Discard, that, again, Draven Jinx can't really use spell mana. Like, that's one of their weaknesses. You can always pass to them. If they bank their mana, they're sending it away. They're never getting it back, right? Like, they'll use their spell mana on, like, turn 8 when they go into Get Excited. That's it, right? So you have a ridiculous advantage. And that's a large part of the reason why aggro decks that are like Draven Jinx are getting driven out. A deck needs to be able to spend spell mana. They need to be able to pass, you know, to be able to function, because otherwise they'll just get abused by, you know, having to go first every turn. And this brings me to a very interesting part of the discussion, which is something that I think not a lot of players have really thought about, even like intermediate or high level players, which is that there's a specific aspect of Legends of Runeterra, which is the idea of a setup independent finisher. What is a setup independent finisher? Well, it's exactly like it sounds. It's a finisher that is completely independent of anything that happened in the previous turns. Feel the Rush is the king of setup independent finishers. Of course, it's replacing War Mother's Call, which we saw before. But Ezreal Draven uses Captain Fran. That's their finisher, by the way, not Ezreal. Ezreal can sometimes be cute in that deck, but it's a minor component to the deck. Fran is just how that deck closes games. And here's why that deck works. Here's why Fran is so good in that deck. And here's something about deck building that you probably haven't thought of before, which is that for a control deck, it's actually really important to have a setup independent finisher. And by the way, almost none of them exist in Legends of Runeterra. Well, what does a setup dependent finisher look like then? Well, Pack Your Bags is a setup dependent finisher. It requires plays to be made in the early mid game to make it work as a finisher. You can't just keep passing. And something like Lee Sin is a setup dependent finisher. In fact, this is Lee Sin's biggest weakness, bar none. Its biggest weakness is that it's setup dependent. What does this mean? This means, and this is super important, if you're playing Ezreal Draven and you're against Lee Sin on turn 3, on turn 4, on turn 5, on turn 6, you can start your turn with a pass and they have to play into you. Not every turn, not every board state, but on like a vanilla board, if nothing's happening, which most boards will be kind of like you can just pass, they have to play first. The Lee Sin player will have to spend their mana because they can't just keep passing. They can't, because their Lee Sin requires mana to be played. It requires spells to be played. Your Fran just gets closer and closer, even if you're both passing all the way down. And the inevitability of that is a huge advantage. That simple fact means that every turn in that matchup, if you're a smart player, if you're playing the Ezreal Draven burn deck, you will pass and they will have to spend their mana first every single turn. And that will give you an insane advantage over the course of the game. You'll have a ridiculous reactivity. And of course, the same is true for Feel the Rush. Now you might say, well, Swim, the ramp cards kind of get you closer to Feel the Rush. Like, what about Catalyst of Eons? And that's kind of true, but not really. Like, if you're passing and your opponent is wasting their entire mana's worth of a turn, you don't really care that you didn't get to Catalyst of Eons, right? Like, it kind of, the end result is the same, that your opponent wasted a turn, right? Which one turn closer to ramp is the same, you know, the same exact value you're getting. Now, if you're thinking and you're particularly clever, you'll actually have noticed that there's one thing about TF Go Hard, the deck, that makes it somewhat setup independent. This is actually a large part of the reason why the TF Go Hard deck runs Ledros most of the time, is because Pack Your Bags is not a setup independent finisher. You have to play in because of Pack Your Bags. So sometimes when you have Ledros as an option, the mere fact that it is in your deck means there's some positions where you can pass and your opponent has to play into you first. And that in certain matchups, in like slower matchups, like if you're against another deck, like, you know, depending on the board state a lot, but if you're against a deck like Ezreal Burn, you can sometimes pass into them. That's a really big deal, and that's something that the deck doesn't have if it doesn't run Ledros. So think about this stuff when you're playing your games, right? Now, a lot of you guys are probably kind of disappointed that this is not like a quick tips video. That like I'm not going to have like a short, bite-sized info packet of information for you to, like, you know, do these 5 cool things and you're going to be a Masters player overnight. This is a very important mentality to understand. And once you understand it and start thinking about this way of thinking in your gameplay, it'll be a lot more clear to you what kind of decision you should make, right? When you're on turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, these kind of key, like, mid-game turns, you want to be thinking to yourself, okay, if I start my turn with a pass, am I really sad if the opponent passes back to me? If the answer is no, if you can just pass, then go ahead, just pass. It will make your play better. You'll have more reactive of an option, right? Alternatively, you could do what I said earlier, because I said there's 2 different ways in the game. There's 2 ways in the game of gaining mana reactivity. You can open pass on your turn, or you can open attack. So open attacking, starting the turn with an attack, means that you are basically locking yourself out of mana, you're locking the opponent out of mana in terms of pre-development mana, and you are riding on either a combat trick, some way to spend your mana to influence the combat at faster burst speed, or alternatively, hoping that the opponent doesn't really have any faster burst options themselves, right? Now, the whole point of, you know, a control deck is to have an option both ways, right? Have slow speed development punishers like Ruination, or Arachnoid Sentry is a good, you know, development punisher card. Something that says, oh, you decided to play into your attack, well, I'm going to mess your attack up even more. And also have open attack punishers. These are any sort of faster burst speed spell from those regions. They basically only have fast spells if we're not counting the freezes like Harsh Winds. And what that means is basically if you're playing against these regions, if they have a lot of mana up, you are forked. You are in a position where you kind of have to guess one way or another what their option will be. And that's why it's so important as the control player to bank maximum mana. But again, I can't stress this enough. This isn't just a control concept. The entire game is around reactivity, right? If I have something on my board that I want to protect, if I have mana up, the control player can't really go in to stop it, right? Depending on if he spends his mana here, I definitely don't mind using Relentless Pursuit. So he could still Notify this Relentless Pursuit. That's always an option that he has. I think there's a decent chance that he might try for the Dragon Link here, and if he does, we can try to slip a Pursuit onto him. The Dragon Link, of course, needs 1 more gem to level up, and once we get that gem out, now our Pursuit's outside of Nopify range, Nopify being 2 mana. We can go ahead and Pursuit here, and MF and Pool Shark both have Challenger, so we can go ahead and take this attack, just kill off both threats. So you see here, you know, in this clip, the guy obviously misplayed by tapping under 2 mana, but you wouldn't call it a bluff. It's not as if he had saved the 2 mana, it would have been bluffing Nopify per se. It's just the fact that if he doesn't spend his mana, I can't spend mine, right? Because again, who spends mana first loses. There's obviously not true in every known situation ever, but it's kind of the rule. That's the rule of thumb of this entire TED Talk that I'm doing. So, I mean, the game is just all about getting these little mana edges, basically, right? I mean, it really depends a bit on the deck you're playing, but this is an important framework that I think a lot of people aren't really thinking about. I'll give you, I mean, here's another example. I'm full of them. Here's an example from me playing the Fiora deck. So we'll slow play this. He's got 8 mana. He's already used 1 single combat. So we have to think, like, what's in his hand range. And honestly,
reading hands is really impossible. It's really fucking bizarre in the mirror, especially because people will play different based on their own hand reads. The mirror of this deck is literally pure poker. Like, both of us are just like, it's just like game theory is involved, and hand reading becomes like, you can actually do bluffs and nothing is set in stone. Normally hand reading is something that you can do very reliably because the opponent has to value playing in a very specific way, but this deck is so bluffable. Here, I mean, I can burn positive. If I Guiding Touch for extra mana, can he punish us with 8 mana when we only have 4? And the answer is no. I've got enough safety cards here. So I can touch here and just be mana efficient and pass again. Again, we're not committing for this turn. If we Pursuit, we go under his mana point, which is just pointless. We play for permanent value and bank maximum mana and maximum reactivity. Reactivity is important. It's not just maximum mana, it's maximum reactivity. Mana is a part of that, but also having cards as options is also a part of that, right? We own a reactivity here. We have the Fiora to force him to play first because ours is bigger, and we've got the same amount of mana next turn and like twice the size of his hand, right? Twice the size of his hand. Okay. Yep. And he can't really do anything there. He knows he can't do anything there because all of his tools in his hand are commitment tools. So if you guys want a conclusion, the conclusion here is keep your mana high, play reactive with your mana. Even if you're playing a deck that's pretty aggressive, you can still afford to be at least a little reactive with your mana, depending on the kind of deck you're playing. If you have colors that can actually use mana in useful, responsive ways, right? Which is most aggro decks, just not Draven Jinx. If you have the ability to, you know, play for a control game plan, bank as much mana as you possibly can, you know, just make sure that you have responses to everything. Think of mana like interest in a game like TFT where like your banked gold gets interest every turn. Mana is kind of the same in Runeterra. Obviously that's a bit of an exaggeration in that comparison because in TFT like mana is like or gold is like everything and interest is like everything. But seriously, your passive mana, every turn your mana just is there before the opponent spends their mana. Your mana is giving you value. It is making your opponents play worse. They are playing with less information and they are playing around more things, right? So if you're looking at the game and just thinking about it with everything I've mentioned here, think about who spends their mana first on the turn. Can I force my opponent to spend their mana before I spend mine? You have to think about these things. And I promise, if you're thinking about the game in this way, it will make you a better player, like a much, much better player, because it'll not only, you know, show you immediate results in your games, but you'll also just kind of improve naturally in other areas if you're thinking in these terms. It'll make you kind of more strategic in the way that you need to be high level in Legends of Runeterra. All right, guys, so that's it for my video. I have no idea when this full guide thing is meant to come out. The idea is this concept is eventually going to be trimmed down to like an 8-minute explanation or something. No idea how that's gonna look, but I mean, I'll need to trim this down a lot because obviously this was just a rambly talk, and eventually this topic I'm gonna need to make very concise for that video. But that's a problem for a future swim. All right, guys, it's a little late for me, but good luck in your games, and I'll catch you guys next time.